Welcome. My name's Emma. I'm the assistant manager and events coordinator here at Fairpond. And tonight we are so thrilled to welcome a staff favorite to celebrate his latest novel, Red Dog Farm, Nathaniel Ian Miller. A little housekeeping before we begin. The bathroom is in the back right corner. The light is outside. Both of the doors will remain open for the duration of the event. Now on to good stuff. Nathaniel is the author of the critically acclaimed debut novel, The Memoirs of Stockholm Sven, which is long listed for the Center Fiction First Novel Prize and has been translated into 5 languages. And his sophomore novel that we're here to celebrate tonight, Red Dog Farm. He holds an MFA in creative writing and an MS in environmental studies from the University of Montana. Is a former resident of the Arctic Circle Expeditionary Program. A former journalist for newspapers in New Mexico, Colorado, Wisconsin, and Montana, he now lives on a farm with his family in Vermont. He's also incredibly elusive because when I was trying to write his bio, that's all I could dig up. I'm usually pretty good at internet sleuthing, but alas, I'll let him come to the screen. Please join me in welcoming Nathaniel Ian Miller.
I don't know if I'm going to sit because it's too weird. I might stand next to the chair, which is even weirder. I'm going to stand for now.
Put your elbow up on the shelf.
Thanks for coming, everyone. I think the format of this thing is I'm going to just bullshit at you for a few minutes, and maybe I'll read a little bit, and then I'm just going to open it up, and you guys can hopefully feel comfortable enough to ask me whatever. Even if it's not about this book, if it's about cows, or my last book. Most of you will not have read this yet, so I understand there's not going to be a lot to ask. But, so yeah, Red Dog Farm. I guess I'll start by saying that, so I've been living on our farm since 2012 here, and we moved here from Montana, and we raised beef cattle for 10 years. And during that period, a lot of people said, you should write about this, and meaning farming. And aside from the fact that most writers, at least the ones that I know or have heard of, hate being told what to do or what to write about, when you're farming, it's like the last thing you want to write about. I think Kaden knows what that's like. It's on your mind constantly. It also just feels so incredibly banal and tedious. So buy this book. My wife hates when I describe farming as boring and then tell people that I wrote a book about farming. Anyway, I didn't want to do it. I was immersed in other projects. Stockholm Sven. I started another book after Stockholm Sven that was a total, had to end up in the trash can. And we were taking a vacation as a family to Iceland and driving around farm country, which I didn't anticipate being. I think I am going to sit in this chair just for a minute. We're driving around, and I'm just remarking kind of ad nauseum out the window about how similar their agricultural practices are in Iceland to in Vermont. I think I was the most interested in that similarity of anyone in the car. But, you've seen either, in this room, if you're in this room, you've either seen Vermont farming or lived it. And so it's the wrapped bales and, the big marshmallows and everything about it, because it's so inclement and so wet. I guess, one and the same, but the practices end up being the same. Anyway, all that to say, the gears were turning. Not that I would write about that per se, but I was just struck And we also visited Vestmannaeyjar, otherwise known as the Westman Islands, which is a little tiny archipelago off the southern coast of Iceland, where the biggest island had a massive eruption in 1973, and the entire island was evacuated. And only one person died a few days later, or maybe even longer than that. But there was this incredibly sort of successful, calm evacuation, including all of the animals on the island. And they ended up, and I sort of heard this story, I can't remember if I heard it while we were there. We climbed to the top of what's now a kind of dormant cone on this island of Heimaey. And you're looking out, you can see the mainland of Iceland, from the top of this thing, and you're looking out this sheer drop. Anyway, it turns out, so in 1973, when they had this evacuation, they airlifted all the sheep. Every single one. And every single one lived, supposedly. The horses were moved by boat, I believe. There weren't that many. And the cows, of which there were even fewer, because it's very hard to sustain beef, or they were not beef cattle, multi-purpose cattle, on a tiny island. You can't really, they bought all their hay off of the mainland of Iceland. It's not sustainable to have more than a few. But there were enough, something like 30 or 40. They all had to be killed. So they were the main casualties of this eruption and evacuation. And that's just sort of this forgotten little piece of arcana from that history. And I later learned it, and it was corroborated by the former mayor of this town, who I got to email with. Anyway, while we were there, I started thinking, okay, I feel like I could write about this. And so this book began as, it was going to be a short story about that evacuation and about the cows that had to all be killed before they could leave the island. And who had to do that? Who was given that task? And it was just going to be a story. And when I started thinking about it in conjunction with the farming, I was trying to put those two together. And anyway, so, one second. Dramatic pause. Long story short, this book is about a small family farm in southwestern Iceland. And what was once going to be an entire story about the Westman Islands in the 1970s is now a kind of, it's a small piece, and it's an important piece of the history of the main character's father, who was there. And you learn it later on in the book. And I'm not giving anything away, really. But, so, it's a small family farm, basically modern day, 2010, I think it takes place, or 11, right after the big financial crash in Iceland. So farmers are down on their luck just like everybody else there. And the main character is this 19-year-old who's just gone off to college, grew up on this farm. He's gone to college in Reykjavik and hates it. It's miserable, which is something I can relate to. And his father is back home on the farm. His mother thinks he's depressed. And so he goes home for a little furlough from university. And it's basically 1 year. The whole story takes place over the course of 1 year as our main character, Ori, goes home to the farm, starts to see it with fresh eyes for the first time. Because when you grow up on a place, as my son can probably attribute, it's hard to have much perspective about it, to see it for what it is, maybe to have any clear sense of what farming is or means, and all the hardship and difficulty that can come with that. And and so, it's a question of, does the farm kid come home And I mean, there's no mystery here. I think I say in the prologue that he does, but it's about how, and how he falls in love with it essentially while his father is falling out of love with it. And so, as you can guess, there's a lot of my own experiences with farm life written into this thing. And so it's very personal, much more personal than anything I ever thought I would write. Much more personal in a way than Sven was. And some of that's just because it's present day, and but anyway, that's sort of a rambling spiel. I thought maybe I'd read a little bit. I think, let's see here. I have 2 chapters I thought might work. They're short chapters, so you don't have to brace yourself for some very long thing. Okay, I want to read about this chapter about their obnoxious neighbor.
Anybody we know?
No comment. He's not in this room. No, I'm just kidding. It's, we've all dealt with obnoxious neighbors. So in this is chapter 4, early on in the book, and the neighbor's name is Ketil. I'm pronouncing it incorrectly because I truly can't pronounce it correctly. There's in Icelandic, anytime you've got 2 consonants together, something very strange happens. They no longer sound like what you think they would. And you'll hear about Papi. That's Papi means dad. And okay, here we go. Chapter 4. The dog heralded Ketil's arrival. Ketil's the neighbor. Before any of us knew he was coming. She whined and clattered her toenails and huffed at the window. It was Saturday, late morning, which found the 3 of us hiding from the feeble, low-slung sun, each in our respective chairs, each with our respective books. Papi had already accomplished his chores and checkups on the bovine maternity ward, and seemed relatively content to do nothing for a little while, since Mama was home. We were one of those rare families that liked being together. Papi groaned when he saw the ratty old flatbed rolling in. He disliked Ketil, but had to stifle it because diplomacy was perhaps his core value, and because Ketil was a neighbor whose years of hard-won, dubious experience in homesteading and machine maintenance were occasionally called upon in times of emergency at our place, and because Ketil was unfailingly, maddeningly generous. "I'm not at home," Papi said. I could never tell when he said this whether he was quoting Bilbo Baggins or had simply become Bilbo Baggins. Mama gathered up her book and made for the back room. "I'm not either," she said. She didn't need a reason to dislike Ketil, and though she taught politics, diplomacy was not her thing. "I guess that leaves us," I said to the dog, cramming my bare feet into a pair of insulated rubber boots and taking a heavy down jacket from the overburdened rack. Riku, that's the name of the dog, Riku preceded me, barking with menace and joy, and she scrabbled her claws all over Ketil's paint job. Fortunately, Ketil did not give a damn about his paint job. The old farmer unfolded himself like an arthritic insect, lanky and unbending, his false teeth clacking in his mouth. He grinned at me. "The prodigious son returns." "Hey, Ketil. Home from the big city, I see, slumming it with the peasants." This was one of Ketil's favorite tactics, calling attention to his erudition with facetious mockery of his ignorance. It was a sword with an impossible number of edges. "You on break?" he said. "Not for another couple of weeks. Just thought I'd bring some classwork home, start vacation early." This takes place in about March or April. I was careful, always careful, to avoid any suggestion that Papi needed help. Not only would it inspire scorn from Ketil, worse, it might inspire his help. Ketil nodded knowingly, He produced his plastic flask of Neftobak, Icelandic nose tobacco, tipped a line of the coarse snuff onto his hand, and disappeared in a couple of hearty, contemplative snorts. "How is the beautiful lady of the house?" he said, with a leer in his voice. Mama may not have needed a reason to dislike him, but if she had, his insistence on calling attention to her appearance would have been sufficient. Sometimes he worked in bizarre references to her background when delivering his lascivious compliments. You have to understand, Mama is a Lithuanian Jew. He once called her a framandi hornkir, or exotic horned cow. We'd spent weeks afterward trying to decide whether he understood the anti-Semitic implications or if he referred only to the rareness of horns among Icelandic cows. That was a regular game in our house. Did Kettle know what he was saying? Fine, she's in the shower, I said, and then instantly regretted it, assuming Kettle's mind would jump at the opportunity to picture her there. "What are you up to, old man?" Just picking up some hay for the critters." Kettle, who had no outbuildings that weren't stuffed with machine parts, stored his square bales at our farm. In return, we used a few as bedding in the maternity ward. "Any babies on the ground?" I looked over his shoulder as though I might see a calf lying in the barnyard, instead of the gory smear that from Foos being dragged up. There's a really gory scene. Trigger warning. A couple chapters before about calf dystocia and death. Cheerily moving on. I'd always been mystified by how blood could leave a tenacious stain in concrete, snow, gravel, dirt. No. We stood in companionable silence for a minute, Kettle watching with a look of beleaguered amusement as Rikuch chased his little Icelandic sheepdog Gurka around the buildings, humping him relentlessly. It didn't matter, of course, that Rikuch was female. This was her place, and she would express her dominance however she saw fit. She hadn't been socialized particularly well way out in the sticks, and she also seemed to resent the fact that Gurka was uncut, oozing useless hormones. They still liked each other, but in a toxic way. "Your dog is a rapist," Kettle said. "Where did Vidya ever get such a horrible thing?" I let the insult wash over me. Rikuch was Papi's dog, but whenever I was back home, she was mine. Papi sometimes made a show of objecting to this, calling her traitor, when in the morning he discovered that she'd slunk from my parents' bedroom and relocated to mine, the better to nose me at the first sign of waking. "You abandoned me," he would say to her, "fickle beast." But we both knew, and we knew Kettle knew, that Rikuch could run literal circles around the rest of the country's native canine stock. In theory, she could outperform the border collies that now outnumbered Icelandic sheepdogs, at least among pragmatic farmers. Border collies only worked the head, and were of course deeply neurotic, seldom able to acknowledge when the workday was over. This is no offense to border collies. I really like border collies. Rikuch was an Australian Kelpie, rust red and long-legged, and though her coat was wholly unsuited to the climate, her intelligence and drive made her an indispensable farmhand, or would, someday. Papi had worked long and hard to find a pup of her breeding, rare outside of Australia, and to wade through the rigid bureaucracy that tried to prevent her immigration. Then he'd waited impatiently during her long quarantine on Krise. Maybe he was on the cusp of paying off. She was 3 years old now. They say Kelpies never tire. Not ever. They can work the heel just as well as the head, depending on what's required. Papi showed me a video once where a Kelpie disappeared into the scrum of a chute packed with nervous sheep, only to reappear moments later on top of the herd, using their woolly ovine backs as a promenade. Rikuch was untested in that regard, but she certainly knew how to conserve energy. Once indoors, warming on the floor, she turned it off like a switch. The only things that made her somewhat disagreeable were horses. She didn't do so well with them. They hated her, and she hated them. Fortunately, we didn't have any. Also, she was an incorrigible yapper. Papi trained her not to do it in the house, but she just replaced the barking with whines and whistles and other alien sounds of the same volume and pitch, and in such speech-like intonations that she seemed part raven. Kettle could cast his aspersions if he liked. I had known the old man since I was an infant, when he held me in one arm and bellowed Icelandic folk songs, which I apparently found reassuring. His retrograde fumblings about ethnicity and religion could be chalked up to a lifetime spent among Icelanders, along with a perverse, ill-conceived desire to prove to everyone just how enlightened and unintimidated he was. As far as he was concerned, his admiration for my mother's appearance was just more evidence of his progressive attitude, and therefore allowed him liberties in his speech. He allowed himself many liberties. And case in point, weren't he and I great friends? Wasn't he, for all intents and purposes, my godfather? He certainly thought so. After a little while, Riku came back in the lather and collapsed at my feet, conserving her spirit until the next big thing. Gurka, looking spent, retreated to the cab of Kettle's truck. Neither of us was in a hurry, though I'd begun to feel the cold through my thin cotton pants. Ah, the farming life, Kettle declaimed. We stared toward the Thverau, where a feeble cloud of steam was rising from the ice. The wind got hold of a cracked plastic bucket and bounced it into a ditch. I figure now I'll just kind of open it up. If anyone has any questions or comments. William, thank you.
Sure. Oh,
You don't have to stand.
well, it's easier now that I can see. I'm curious about the just sort of the creative defamiliarizing, unlocking of any ability or inclination to write about home and farming, and how leaving and looking back at it made you see it differently enough to make it storyable?
Yeah. That's a very good question. And I think the answer is that sometimes that was very thorny. Sometimes I worried that this was turning into like secret autofiction, which made me feel squirrely and panicky. I've never particularly wanted to write my story or felt that it was worth telling. So yeah, some perspective was certainly needed. And at the time, when I began it, we still had cows. I've since sold our beef cattle. Who knows what I'm doing? I don't know what I'm doing. Here I am. And so that didn't really afford any. It's not like I was farming a lot less, I think, or that's happened in the last year or so. But I mean, I had to think of it as an act of transposition, and through that transposition, I was alienating myself from the material. So I could kind of fill things in with detail as needed. And I knew there were certain kind of nasty, harrowing farm stories I was just going to use. And I knew that because it was the conceit is a year, there's certain things that you're going to have to go through over the course of that year in a farm situation. But I mostly had to try to keep myself and my life at arm's length while simultaneously using it to build these characters, and who are very close. You know, it was ticklish, and often very uncomfortable, and probably not something I would ever do again. Wholly different process from writing Sven, which felt like every step was into the void. And that's how it feels again on the thing I'm writing now. Like every chapter, I have a sense of where I'm going, but it's just a cold emptiness between me and it. Whereas this, I had with the year, with these certain hard truths of farm life that I knew I was going to hammer the readers with. Very different process. I wouldn't say I gained any insight as to how one could do it or how I did it, but I know it often felt. I don't know if any of you have ever been journal writers. I don't. I used to be when I was a kid, but I'm not someone who likes to engage. I feel sometimes that putting things on paper is manifesting the pain of whatever I'm trying to say, and so in some ways this could feel a little akin to that at times. Like I had to dredge up some painful memories and some not so painful. But I don't think this is a misery slog. It's not. It's not misery porn. But you. That's a good question.
I'm curious how you parse out your time, being a farmer and being a writer and being part of family.
Yeah.
How do you do that?
With difficulty. It's gotten a little easier now that we've sold the cows, for sure. But like when I was writing Sven, I was all over the place, and I didn't have a process in terms of time and using it efficiently. And so because of that, it took me fucking 8 years to write the thing or something like that. Because I 2 years would go by without me contributing anything to it. Because I'd get so busy in the farm, and then I would have stepped away too long. I'd be playing the banjo with Ted, or and nothing would be happening. So I had, by the end of it, I had to basically just make myself spend a little time in the morning, and that essentially became my routine. And I've now clung to that and try to stick with it pretty religiously. Where I get up in the morning, we get my son ready for school, and either I'm taking him or I'm picking him up. So whatever happens there, I try to get myself in the chair. And now a lot of writers will say morning, that's how it is for me. If I don't get a couple of hours in there first thing in the morning, it's gone. There's too many other things to do. He's got sports, farm needs, I'm still, even though we don't have cows, there's a zillion things to do on the place, and snow to move, and it's just, and I'm not somebody who, as you can see, likes to sit still for very long, and so, that's my time, and if I miss it, it's gone. That's a lost day. And during the weekend, I don't write usually unless I'm in a craze, I'm gonna finish this thing, because he's home and we're hanging out. But and if I try to write too late, sometimes I'll get a little I get some ideas I want to write and it's getting a little late. I have to not let myself do that because I get wired. The act of writing is, for some people, I think, a pleasant sort of exorcism, and for me, it's not. It's more like maybe the demon comes out, but the demon's just hanging out there, yelling at me. So it's pain. There's no pleasure or relief from it other than a feeling I did something worthwhile today, maybe.
Along the same lines, since you sold the animals, is there a period of time or when you're doing something else like you're in the shower or you're doing a chore where you get your best ideas? I find when I'm cleaning the barn or I'm doing something else that's when the distraction can come and other ideas come. Did you miss something by doing that, or did part of the writer disappear with the disappearing of the farmer?
That's a very good question. I think of them as two discrete parts of myself rather than one necessary to the other. Maybe that's because that's how I originally conceived of the whole project. I thought when we moved here, I've been doing other jobs beforehand, many. I thought, okay, I'm going to be part farmer, part writer, not combining the two. I wasn't going to write about farming, and I wasn't going to think about writing while I'm farming or farming while I'm writing. And, none of that works out the way you planned to. But I really thought, I guess, that it would be about 50-50. That was dumb. I mean, farming takes up all your time and more. So it ended up being like 90 farming, 10% writing. And I'll answer your question about when I think about writing in a second. But basically, when Sven finally sold after 2 years, 200 rejections from agents, it was a long process. I didn't have any. I don't think I had any big illusions like I've hit the big time, because I didn't. But I did think, okay, I can now really call this part of my identity. I am a writer, at least some real percentage, and I need to shift these proportions. And so that gave me license to kind of get rid of the livestock at least for a while, bring that writing percentage way up and the farming lower. I don't know what it's currently at, but so I'm thinking of them as two different things. So when I'm out there doing menial work, and it's always been that way, and I've done a lot of menial work in my life, there's nothing really interesting happening in here. Like I've got a song, an annoying song on repeat. Sometimes it's a Christmas song that's really bad. Or some stressful thing that I'm poring over. Usually nothing useful. If I go for a walk in the woods, however, that is really productive time for me. My mind starts to wander. I get good things from walks. That's probably my most generative time. Obviously, when it's like this, nobody's walking. So.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any questions?
Whatever happened to that short story, and did it ever get written? Will you ever write it? Or is it then?
It basically became a chapter.
Okay.
And when you read it, you'll know you're there. I don't want to say too much about it, but like that chapter is the story that I wanted to write. And I did think for a while it would be the whole thing. I'm glad it wasn't, because I enjoyed telling a more modern story, and it felt more like an important bit of backstory. And also, at least around Iceland and people who are familiar with Iceland, that's like the story. Unless you're going to do something really deadly obvious, like write about Vikings or elves, then the eruption on Westmont, even if you haven't heard of it, a lot of people have. So there have been books on that subject, and so it's been done in different ways, and it felt sort of too obvious to make a whole, and too kind of appropriative in a way to take that really foundational story and make that the whole sort of thing. So I have it right now as the entire chapter is told by the dad, and so there's no dialogue. It's just him telling this whole long story, and it's very. I allowed myself the liberty of making it a little stagey that way in how it relates to the rest of the book. It's like this dramatic pause. I think of it, I don't know if anyone here has ever watched much Irish theater. I like Irish theater. I don't like a ton of theater, but I do like Irish theater. And there's this thing that happens in a lot of Irish plays where, the characters, there's a lot of talking. They're talking, they're figuring things out, and then somewhere around like the 3/4 mark of the play, like the room, it's often a pub, Pub gets quiet. Connor McPherson is a great one if you guys have ever seen any of his plays. The Weir is fantastic. The pub gets quiet and one character just starts talking. And it becomes this extended monologue. And you learn a great deal. It's not some sort of massive unveiling, but it's this like deep, almost microscopic look into that one character's outlook. And of course it does reveal a great deal about, I know I'm talking in very vague terms, but that's how I was thinking about it. This is like my Connor McPherson moment. Anyway.
Well, I have to ask a question about the 200 rejection letters.
Oh, yeah.
And what did you do in that time period? Like, did you go back and rework it, or did you just keep trying to find the right fit? Like, what happened there?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of despair. Major despair. What happened is, they tell you when you're looking for an agent to, the conventional wisdom online is to do huge amounts of research into every agent you're querying and tailor your letter to them and their specific interests and flatter them and why you're right for them. And talk about a total mindfuck. And I would try to write these things and I would spend days writing one query letter only to have no response. Most of these rejections were just no response. Oh. And so, and plus, I wasn't about to change my book. Good. And so I was desperate to have it be read and to see the light of day. But what happened was I became completely demoralized after about a month. And because I wrote a book before Sven, and I'd gone through this process as well, gotten an agent twice, 2 different agents, 2 different times. It never went anywhere. So I already had a book in the cabinet, the shelf, whatever they say, that I had to sort of put aside. And I really didn't want to again, but I didn't have the wherewithal to keep at this. So enter my wife, Ailish, who works full-time, and yet took this on without being asked. In fact, I might have said, you don't need to do this, or please don't. But she really believed in the work, and she said, I don't give a fuck about these personalized query letters. I'm going to do the shotgun approach. And just started blasting queries. They say, oh, you can't query the same agent at an agent at the same agency that you just queried. Forget that. Everybody got this thing. And she instantly started getting traction. I did have a theory, which is because so much of this stuff, they're getting these massive slush piles, right? And their email inboxes are filling up every day. Untold, there's such a glut of writers, untold numbers of people are trying to get in. And so any reason they have not to open your email or not to read your query, never to ask for a sample, they will take. And that includes, like, did they eat something that was not cool for lunch that day? Or, the wind is blowing from the north, south, east, or west. Or, as I was theorizing, do you have a boring name? Miller. O'Hurley. So she sent my queries from her email inbox. And they were still my queries signed by me with my name, but coming from her email. So they were getting emails from Ailish O'Hurley. And those emails were getting opened. And then so my queries got read, suddenly people are asking for samples. Still though, the process took a year in that case, but 200 went out that never came back, or at least didn't come back in a good way. And it ended up being, in the end, one person who passed on it, but nicely, said, oh, I have a friend who I think might like this. And that alone, that process took 6 months of like getting this other agent to read it, and he ended up being my agent. But yeah. So when I see like writers just starting that process, I mean, God, my heart goes out to them, and I got no advice but marry someone who likes your work.
It has a cool name.
It has a cool name. Exactly.
Frank Howard Mosher would put his rejection letters on the barn door
Oh, is
and
that
shoot him with the shotgun.
yeah.
So how did you arrive at a point where you stuck a novel or an undeveloped novel in the trash?
Well, so I won't say it's in the trash.
Okay.
It's certainly on ice. Not willingly, not for lack of trying. I knew that first novel, this is pre-Sven, was a hard sell. So I went into it thinking, it's really short. It's 50,000 words. It wouldn't be short for like the French. They like short books. Or more and more people do. And it's sort of nasty, brutish, and short. And it's a tricky sell, and I would get some comments back from it like, "Wow, that was really cool. I read that in one sitting, but man, no." And, yeah, I get that. So I'm now at the point where I've got like, in the U.S. I'm still nobody, but in France they really liked Sven, and my publisher there has already had this translated. It's coming out just in a month. And she's like, give me anything you got. Give me your short stories from when you were 12, basically. And, she's perfectly willing to sell this nasty, brutish, and short book. But through the, delicate little vagaries and vicissitudes of publishing, it's gotta at least be given a chance in the States before I can get it over there. And so I'm just figuring out timing. Like, I would love for it to come out someday. I don't want to alienate everybody who liked these. I'll alienate a few. This is going to alienate a few. Who am I kidding? But yeah, it's a timing issue. Like, if it's going to come out at all, it probably wouldn't come out with the big publisher like Little Brown. Maybe a smaller independent publisher, and that would be great. That would be ideal. Just and then they can publish it in translation in France, and the French like weird dark shit, and they won't be turned off by it. Yeah. Any questions? Yeah.
I love hearing about sort of where authors' ideas come from, like the story of the island. That's really cool.
Yeah.
Tell us about Sven.
So, without getting into too long a spiel, Sven was a real guy, but bears almost no resemblance to the Sven in the book. I was on an artist residency aboard a tall ship that was going around the archipelago of Svalbard, and we got to go inside the hut of this guy. All we were told was, here's the hut of Stockholm Sven. His face was mutilated in a horrible mining accident, and he removed himself here for the rest of his life. That turned out to almost none of that was true, except that it was his hut. And I had been there with a very different idea of what I was going to write in this residency. I was going to write about the old explorers from the 1800s, and but I that hut in such a monumental expanse of land and water really captured my imagination, and I started to think about what kind of person would choose that life, what it would do to that person, what kind of alterations they'd have to make in order to survive, in order to keep sane over so many years. And so that was the origin of Sven. And I later found out, I did try in the writing process to learn as much as I could about the real guy. I'm glad I didn't find out more, because I would have been really hamstrung trying to make it fit. And it would have been a very different book, and I think a worse book. Turned out the real guy was like not so much of a loner after all. In fact, he loved to hang out back in Longyear, which is the main town, and like hang out with a lot of prostitutes. And maybe his face wasn't mutilated at all, and he was a plumber. And actually, he was so popular that when he died, they had the largest funeral procession that Svalbard had ever seen up until that point. So clearly not our guy. I mean, this is all before, the Nazis invaded. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, just wondering how you think about or feed off of your work with other writers. It seems like with Sven, you were reading a lot of the wars before, and there's also a lot of Sven that I understand why the French would like it. A lot of that late 19th century, early 20th.
Yeah.
How do you work with or be bothered by other writers?
I mean, you mean writers that I read?
Yeah. Does it help or does it get you more?
I think it can only help up to the point where it's imitation. And I have to be careful about that, because if I really love a writer, I can find myself starting to imitate them a little bit in my style. And I'm very protective of my voice. Cue the eye rolls. You can do it. But I'm someone who, while I lack confidence in most other realms, I do know that I have a voice. And some writers don't. And they're the ones who really get into deep shit with editors, because they'll just have their way with it. But I always know at least how I want to say a thing. And that's my voice. And it will be influenced if I'm reading a lot of one thing. So sometimes I just smile, and like with Sven, and I was reading and rereading Patrick O'Brian. And you could see there's some just straight up rip-offs. And let's call them tributes. In terms of phrases, I just love the way he does it, and so it's this push and pull. With this book, I was reading an Icelandic writer. I think it just happened that way. Named Jón Kalman Stefansson, whose work is either just about, he's been published in France and in England for a while now, but he hasn't really picked up here. He's considered by many Icelandic people to be their greatest living writer. And he has a totally original style. And I've got a cough drop if you need one. You need a cough drop? He's got this, aside from the fact that grammar is kind of thrown out the window. Everything has this sort of momentum. I don't know any other way to describe it. It's very musical writing, but doesn't feel self-consciously so. And kind of, you could see a through line from, if anyone's read the old sagas, I mean, the Icelandic sagas, there's this certain, like, oral storytelling style, like a, I don't know how to put it, but like you're standing around a campfire, Homeric in a way, poetic. It feels like prosody, and one way I let that kind of bleed into me in this book was I'm usually just a rigid pain in the ass about grammar, and but not really. I mean, I get away with putting it to the side like every other writer by using 10,000 em dashes. But having like taught writing and composition and all that stuff, there's certain things that I have trouble letting go of. And, you know, one of them is like this classic comma splice, and you know, I really like to see punctuation where it needs to be, break up those sentences, and God, how many people I taught who hated my guts probably because of that. But in this book, I was like, sorry, old students, you know, I'm going to splice the shit out of this book. Because it allowed me to get this kind of current of movement from one sentence to the next, from one fragment to the next. You'll see it immediately if you read the book. So that came, I don't know if Kalman does much of that, but it was an idea that it came to me reading his work.
It struck me in Sven because there's such a through line through it, but also great different sections that are very different in sort of a writerly sense or a painterly sense, where the tone and perspective and the sort of language of the shifts. Which is, you're thinking about that a lot.
You mentioned your editor or editors a minute ago. Can you tell us more about your relationship with your editor? I'm always curious. Well, I'm in a book club. I'm sure most of us are, and I read so much. I'm just like, this didn't need to be 550 pages. And where was your editor? Did they fall asleep? What's going on? So.
Yeah, I mean, each one is so different. Obviously, mine happened to be fired. So it sounds like it's a classic story. You know, it's like a trope at this point. But the one I worked with on Sven is the one who acquired this, and he takes his time. Let's say that, and you know, we were coming up against the deadline had been pushed and pushed and pushed. I was waiting for my edits, and getting nervous that the whole publication date would get pushed. And this is just last May. Give me a sign if I'm telling too much. I could think he's seeing that camera and thinking, stop talking. I'm saying really.
It's recording.
I'm recording. I thought of some of the things I said already as I forgot the camera was there. He got fired. You know, these publishing houses are hemorrhaging people, just left and right. It was a major hemorrhage in his case. A bunch of editors gone, a bunch of other people gone, and so it looked. Fortunately, we'd just done what they call like the big edits, and you know, that's the sort of the bigger picture, and I had been ready for them because I knew kind of what they were going to be. I go into, because I'm a prima donna about my work, I go into the editing process already a little combative, but pretending I'm not. Like, oh, I'm just so easy to get along with, you know, like, everything's going to be fine. And, you know, in the back, I'm like, make me change that word. And, but I know, I have a sense pretty early on what they're going to want to change. And so I start kind of acclimating my brain to, I could do a little of this, I could yeah, I could make that a little more obvious or whatever the thing is. And so I was ready to do the big edits, finally get him, and then he was fired. I'm not sure he ever even saw the edits. And that was the dangerous point because this particular editor, mine, is very light on the big edits and heavy on what they call the line edits, which is like working through every sentence one by one, making sure it's as tight as possible. And you can imagine that's the part where I'm most combative.
Yeah.
Because I'm a sentence level writer rather than a big picture writer. In fact, let's just say my books don't have plots. And so he didn't get to really do that with me, and I was thinking he's not going to release this book for production. But, you know, bless him, knowing that I would be tossed into a kind of purgatory waiting for a new editor, potentially have the book canceled, which was happening, or, you know, pushed way into the future. He just... So yeah, this is the dirty secret. I line edited my own book. So this book was never line edited. So if you see some grave errors, that's why. But no, I mean, it then goes through many copy edits and
Right.
many readers see it. But that editor line edit moment didn't happen. He passed it through into production. So everything stayed on schedule.
And what did you think about the big picture edits that you got before he left?
I mean, they were what I expected, more or less. Like, I know his taste, and so there's always this kind of compromises you're going to have to make. They frame it like, oh, everything's up to you. You know, you don't do anything you're not comfortable with, but if you don't do it, we're gonna work on this forever.
Right.
And so you have to know, like, how far can you push, how far can you be pushed before you, and so I knew, because in our first conversation about this book, when he was in the process of acquiring it, because of his style, instead of saying, like, well, I really loved your book, you know, can't wait to work with you on it. It was more like, here's what you're probably going to need to change. So he basically told me like a year before we did the edits. And at the time I was like, yeah, fuck you, I'm not doing any of that. And fast forward a year, I was willing to do a little of that. And mostly it was predictably, no one in this room will be surprised to learn that publishing houses want stuff to be more commercial. They don't want to publish weird experimental art.
That's for the French.
Yeah, exactly. And, so in that vein, you've got a relationship in this book. More tension, always more tension. That's something that I feel like is being pushed not only from the editorial side but from marketing. You always want, like, there to be obstacles, and I went into this project and I wrote this book thinking of the tension, the obstacles, everything that needed to be overcome, basically being the farm. Like, farming is the tension. Everything else is sort of ancillary. And in this case, in this family, because this family actually, yeah, everybody's got problems, but they really like each other. You know, it's sort of, that's not the issue. But so a lot of the editorial, the big edits were, where can you put more tension?
Like, oh, sorry.
You mentioned, you mentioned the book that hasn't been published yet. You mentioned something, I think you mentioned something currently in the works. Do you, like, actively try to bank ideas, or do you kind of wait for stuff to happen and think, like, oh, this is maybe something that could go somewhere someday?
Definitely the latter. If I were banking them, I would be broke. They're so few and far between. I mean, I wish I was one of these people just like fielding ideas from the heavens, you know. No, I'm more like hold very still for 3 years and something's gonna come, you know, like a sluggish, bloated river. If you watch it long enough, you know, something's gonna float by. That's how it feels to me. So no, I'm never planning very far ahead because I'm just hoping I'll have an idea. And I had one that I maybe who was asking me about shelving. When did I know to shelve? Because I did shelve one for real, right after Sven, and that was because I had a lot of big ideas, and it was post-apocalyptic, and I was going to incorporate a lot of my interests, and you know, it was. I realized I'd written like 20 pages of exposition, which nobody wants to read that, and. Plus, everybody and their mother was writing dystopian, post-apocalyptic, and I just thought, I'm not doing this right. I'm not doing this well enough to warrant another post-apocalyptic novel. I mean, I still got the file. It's not fully trashed. Maybe some of it is salvageable, but I kind of doubt it because, you know, I don't know if you ever heard about Steve McQueen's dream project that he was hoping, that he was working on and wanted to make before he died of mesothelioma. But it was like incorporating all the stuff that he thought was cool, and it was like dirt bikes and the Yucatan and this and this, and you know, one of these bloated. That's how my project felt. It was like cigar rolling and Sotol and you know. Mostly, I thought because it was, you know, we're deep in COVID. Because Sven came out 2021, and I couldn't really travel. I need to be in a place to write about it. That comes first for me. I was a nature writer first. I have to smell the things, see the things, and because I couldn't go to the DR and write about, you know, cigar rolling, which is what I wanted to do. I was like, I'm going to write about the American West because I lived there for 15 years and I can, that's banked. But, yeah, in the shelf.
Do you think that there are any common threads among your books?
Yes, I know there are. Dogs. But mostly they're all about some kind of seclusion, alienation, isolation, in one form or another. Some way in which those forces are working to oppress the main character and illuminate. I find myself returning to it again and again, whether it's a more literal interpretation of those themes, like this book that maybe you'll see the light of day someday is about a fallout shelter. So it doesn't get much more literal than that. Or Sven in his hut. But I'm often writing about characters who either are alone or feel alone and are oppressed by that, and but yet are sort of growing within it. And then I through that conceit, I love the feeling of bringing in these surprisingly strange, warm characters who can. And the found family thing, you know, often ends up happening for me, just because I'm writing these disaffected characters, and I don't want to write a book where somebody starts disaffected and ends that way. You know, I've seen it done. You know, I've seen it done well. But the grouchy misanthrope who's still a grouchy misanthrope at the end is like, I'd rather have them become fully rounded human beings through the people around them, and that's what pokes a bunch of holes in their isolation, even if things never turn out rosy, if that makes sense.
That's a good place to pause. So much for coming. Patty's selling books up front and Nathaniel's gonna sign, so feel free to
Thank you.
hop on
Thanks.
up.